Welcome to the Community Show. I'm Hari Berzins, and I have a treat for you today. We are going to hike the Dodd Creek Trail with Jane Cundiff and Fred First, the creators of the trail, and they are going to tell us all about what we see as we walk along the trail. So stay tuned.
Okay.
So say a little bit about this trail and the history of it. You were there from the beginning.
Okay, yes, and this is Fred First, and I'm Jane Cundiff, and we're here, both of us were here from the beginning and helped build this community trail. And it was really a community effort. And here's a little sign that has some of the pictures of the people involved. Of course, the town and the county and the rec authority all helped. The forestry department, you know him, and he came out. He was glad to go through with his cool bulldozer and blaze the way. We had the Boy Scouts build benches along the way, and the garden club came out here, and we marked a lot of the signs, and Fred helped me identify trees. So it's really been a community effort all the way. The Partnership for Floyd is the organization that actually lined out the trail and got it all organized, got all these people together and got this trail going, and still kind of keeps in touch with it to make sure it stays clear and nice for everybody. But the trail is an educational trail, which really makes it special. We've got so many, probably more than 40, and I've just made some new signs, so there'll be more than 60 different signs along the trail that identify all kinds of trees and bushes and other perennials.
And you told me something I didn't know the other day, that this trail, part of it was the original Route 8?
Yes, actually we'll be down by the river, and Route 8 came around a little bit farther back there, so we'll be down on that old part. So we can walk through the trail. By the way, the trail allows dogs on a leash, and it's not too many people here, so it's a wonderful place to come and visit.
But I would also say that it's a young forest. It's been in agriculture. If you go back to the maps to the 30s and 40s, it was all an old field, and you can tell that, although along the creek where they couldn't log or couldn't farm, there's some big trees, and so that's where the most mature part of this trail are. And the highest diversity of some plants, although diversity is higher in the old field opening for the power lines.
Right, so we're going to look at some diversity along the way and what's growing here. And it's fairly typical of second stage succession, it's called, around this area, where things are growing back after they've been cut down. So we'll lead you down along the trail and come visit us. So this is one of the signs. This is at the very beginning of the trail here. This is basically a Chinese elm. It was an ornamental that was planted there. They brought them into the United States kind of as a replacement to a lot of our dying elms. But we put these signs along the path, and they're fairly small, but they tell a little story about the trees here and the perennials. There's another one there, and I just placed that one there, and I've got lots more to place. The trail continues to grow, and I continue to learn, so it's a lot of fun to learn more about these plants and put some information out there.
Jane, you can see the fruits of typical elm fruits here.
Oh yeah, it sure is.
That's sort of a dead giveaway, those little flat wafers.
Yeah, it is.
It's another Virginia pine.
Look at this guy's
See
here.
a lot of that. We spoke earlier about this being an old field succession, meaning that when it's bare ground from cultivation, the things that come in naturally are the things that tolerate full sunlight, for one thing. And these Virginia pines, which are generally considered scrap pines because they don't make timber, are one of the first ones to come in, and the locust and the brambles. But another one close to the ground are the mosses, and the mosses are even pioneer plants on bare rocks. Any place you can get a little crevice to get a spore started, and they over time begin to break down the rock and create soil. So that's one of the earliest pioneers. And so if we came here in 50 years, it would look much like it's going to look for us down along the creek, which is mature woods.
Right, so most of these pines will outcompete each other and die off. The bigger ones will stay. And the young hardwoods are growing up underneath the shade, which is interesting because young hardwoods can do a little bit better under the shade of some shade. And here's one right here.
Hickory and a tulip poplar.
Right there we have already the beginnings of what'll eventually be the climax biome, it's called, as all of the eastern United States would be
birch.
mixed forest. So there's birch, there's probably even a young
gum.
oak in there somewhere. And here on this side we see one of the stages of succession where you have all the brambles coming in. So these guys need a lot more light, and then as the trees get thicker, you don't see so many. You don't see too many blackberries in the middle of a dense woods. But here we've got both. I think here's the black raspberry, and there's probably some blackberry. This is a blackberry here, and then there's a whole lot of other things that are here in this stages of succession. And actually this stage of succession is a good place for pollinators. You get a lot of these wildflowers and things in that stage.
And there's not much wasted space. I mean, if you look at that, pretty much every square inch has something growing in it. The productivity is pretty high.
Yeah, nature's really amazing.
Efficient.
If your garden looked like this, everybody'd say, "Oh, how bad that was." But you know, it's not so bad. Nature's able to do it. They communicate and cooperate, and it's really an amazing mix of plants.
So this plant goes by several names. It's called touch-me-not or jewelweed or impatiens. And the touch-me-not comes from the fact that the seed pods, and this one may not do it, but the seed pods, boing, are spring-loaded and put out the little seeds over some distance. And they're actually quite tasty. Tastes like hickory nuts.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
Jane,
I'm ready to eat that.
You didn't know something that's edible? You're slipping, girl.
I really love all the wild edibles. Nature's got so much to offer.
But don't be surprised if you see her down on her hands and knees grazing.
But jewelweed is really well known for its ability to stop poison ivy itch.
Yes.
And it's in all those concoctions, those natural concoctions.
If you pull the plant, the base of it's really watery. These may not be, but we used to take pieces of it and put it in the freezer for when the kids got a bee sting or a itch and rub that on. It really has some, it's being studied pharmacologically for those properties.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can get just a little stem here. You can see, we can get the light right, the stems are real watery, especially the bigger ones, and they're juicy. And so one that's an inch across, you just scratch the surface and rub it on your arm or wherever. And the sting goes away.
And you can apparently actually collect the juice of that by just throwing a bunch of it into a blender, straining it out, and then freezing little cubes of it. I've got a little cube of it in my freezer. So the frozen cube and the non-itch stops an itch.
So you got the cold and the
yeah, exactly.
pharmacy. We'll only see a few ferns walking today, and mostly it will be this fern on the side of the road bank, which is where you typically see them. And if you didn't know the name, they're pretty easy to identify, but if you did know the name and you didn't take advantage of smelling them, you're missing a treat. They're called hay-scented fern, and they smell more early in the year than they do now, but guess what they smell like?
Hey!
Hey, you! It's just a sweet, clean smell. And we're going to scratch and sniff a few other things before we're done here. The sense of smell is something that's underutilized in the natural world, and it's tied in with memory and meaning. And I encourage people to scratch and sniff. My kids thought I was crazy. When I was teaching, we went from a course on plants to salamanders, and they said, "You're not going to make us scratch and sniff the salamanders, are you?" I didn't.
Scratch and sniff.
Denstidia punctulobula. Isn't that wonderful? Don't you like saying that?
Yeah. I'm thinking maybe they use this for bedding or something. It's so nice. One of the things we really are trying to learn more about is how all these different things were used in times when people didn't have factories to make things for them.
Mm-hmm. They were ingenious, out of necessity. My name for this is embroidery moss. I think technically it's called brocade moss, but it looks like it's done with a needle and thread, and it's really soft and make a nice pillow. But that's an old stump of a tree, a fairly large tree that's gone, maybe cut. And that pioneer moss is coming in and taking over and already made that much soil. Holds the moisture, creates nutrients. Handy plant.
And it also harbors tardigrades.
Water bears.
That's right. I don't know if you know about tardigrades or water bears,
Most
but
of the world doesn't know about
they're the
tardigrades.
coolest organism. They're animals. They look like little what?
They're little 8-legged bears,
Yeah.
roly-polies, and they sort of move like they're half asleep, but they sent them to outer space and brought them back. They've frozen them, they've dried them for 100 years, a drop of water and they come back to life.
Yeah. And they're so tiny you need a good microscope to
yeah.
see them. But they are totally amazing little organisms.
What we have here is another plant that is not that uncommon, but you don't see it very often because it tends to be in the understory, and where the other things have come up to overshadow it, it's invisible. And it's a member of a group, well, generally called fox pine, running pine, jumping cedar, all sorts of common names. But it's a plant more related to ferns than it is to flowering plants. It never has any flowers. It produces by spores. And here are the spores. They're not quite mature. When they're mature, they're bright and yellow, and you can go thump, and spores come off of that. And they used to use those spores and flashes for cameras because they're explosive. They're full of oil. And that gets a student's attention. Hold the match right there, and I'm going to thump it. It's amazing.
Around here, they call that ground pine a lot. I've heard that.
Mm-hmm.
And it comes in clumps. And in some areas, it seems to be, it's everywhere. It's really common. And then you don't see it anywhere. So
Yep.
it's really a clumped. Most of nature is clumped, which is confusing sometimes because you see a bunch of stuff and you think it's everywhere. But it may be the only spot it exists. And so we have to be aware of who's common and who's not before we take it down. So this is the Dodd Creek.
This is one of the plants that you don't see, even though it starts coming up in the early summer. It doesn't flower until about this time of year. It's called giant lobelia. It's got the 3 distinctive lower lips, lower petals. And it's related to my favorite fall wildflower called cardinal flower, which is also a lobelia, but it's bright, bright red and not this tall. But this is a great place, and we've got some phlox and some sunflower relatives, jump seed. Jane, what's this one? This silphium.
I
It
don't
collects
know
water
that
at the base of the leaves, which is another place to find water bears, by the way.
Oh, good.
So a lot of diversity down here. This is interesting. This is dodder,
Oh,
which is basically white and never turns green because it's parasitic on the roots of other plants. And it uses other plants, instead of having its own stem, it uses the support of other things like this wing stem here. I don't think we saw any of
now
that.
that wing stem has got a story on its own.
Yeah,
It's
we'll
very
be-
cool. So you can see all these flowers up in here. This time of year have these beautiful little yellow, look like almost like yellow daisies with a green center in it. But the most telling thing, if you look really right on the stem, is there's wings on the stem. And so there's little pieces of green sticking out from the stem. And that's why it's called wing stem. So it's pretty easy to identify.
Another name for it's stickweed, because the stem has a lot of woody tissue in it. And I've known people that cut it and used it for kindling in the winter,
Oh,
which I never did.
yeah,
But there's plenty of it.
that's good.
These are the seeds or the nuts of beech, therefore beech nuts, which I don't think they use these in the gum. And if anybody's ever carved their initials on any kind of tree, it's probably the beech tree, also called elephant legs by some people, because the trunk has very thin bark. And you can do it. You can carve your initials in the tree, but you expose that tree to fungus and insects and bird damage and all sorts of other things. And it's not like beech trees need any more risk. There are a number of diseases, some new diseases that are starting to decimate the oaks, like the elms and the chestnuts and the ash have already been damaged by invading pathogens. There's one called beech leaf disease that's still only in New York and a couple of northeastern states, but it's really spreading fast, and people are very worried about it. And I didn't know anything about it until fairly recently. That would be a real loss. And you think about a beech tree like that, especially one up on the side of the hill, could be the mother tree for 100 other beech trees that have sprouted off the roots of that tree over generations and generations. And not only that, they communicate through those roots and the root hairs of fungi called mycorrhizae to cooperate with each other, to send nutrients and water back and forth. And we're just starting to learn about that level of competition in the forest that we've only known for a decade or so. So it's a much more active place than we used to think it was.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's this web of life that we're immersed in. And every day, I mean, every single breath that we take has to do with this place around us. We owe nature. We need her for every breath we take, every drop we drink, and every bite we eat. And we have lost that connection, that memory of knowing what is around us. And we can talk to people, and so many other people. The Native Americans don't even know it anymore. A few might, but basically, I was told that it used to be that Native Americans knew 300 or 400 species. They could walk out. Every one of them knew the plants around them. They knew what they could eat and what was used for this medicine or that medicine. What did they use for bedding, housing, all kinds of things. Everything came from their own backyard. But now we have factories, and the factories are causing a lot of problems. And so if we could only get to know this beautiful forest and this beautiful nature that we live in, we'd be a lot better off.
But great things are happening. I'm encouraged by what I see. You know, the last 2 generations, nature and the economy have been at odds with each other. We're realizing that to our peril. And so now those are starting to overlap and strengthen each other. And that's what this eco-fair is all about, is starting to reassess our relationships with nature, each other, and our community. And so this is just a microcosm of how that relationship starts. And it starts in the soil, in the air, and the water. And that's why we can't take it for granted. And even a little short trail like this through not the most mature, beautiful land in the world is still a classroom. We want more and more people to come here and learn what it has to teach.
One of the things I wanted to show you here is the canopy underneath a little bit older forest. So here we are down by the river. The land is pretty steep here, and when it's really steep, it doesn't get logged as often, and so you get larger trees. And this that we're standing on is actually part of old Route 8. Now, I'm not sure how the cars actually got through here, but it looked pretty narrow. But they had these hillsides here, and they were stabilized by those trees. And you can see how those trees hold on to the soil. You do not see big gullies washing out of forest. You see big gullies washing out of pastures and places, lands where land has been cleared. But the trees want that water, and they grab it. And the roots of the tree are often just as big as the tree is, which is incredible if you look up that tree and think about how huge that is and all the branches out there, and think about it going down into the earth and about almost the same mass of roots as underneath the ground. So they take that rain and that water and they take it all the way down into the ground, and they help recharge our aquifers, and they hold that water from flooding. So old forests are very important to prevent flooding, hold on to water, and recharge our aquifers. So we want to keep them as much as possible.
If you look up and down the road, you see the dappled light, maybe 2 or 3% of full sunlight? That also holds moisture and gives rise to plants that can't take full sunlight. Here are a couple down here that are fairly uncommon. This one's called wild ginger, which has a thick leathery leaf, and if I pulled it and scratched and sniffed, like we've done some other things, it smells like ginger, although it's not the oriental ginger that's used in cooking. But it's a beautiful leaf, and it's found in shady, more mature places like this. The other thing we see, a sign of maturity, is this cluster of basswoods here, 3 or 4 all coming out from the same stump growth. And you can see, if you look carefully, all the way up the trunk are sapsucker holes, because maples are not the only thing that sapsuckers suck. There's sugar in a lot of different trees, and the sapsuckers come really, really early because they feed off of that sap. They don't have to wait for insects and other things to eat. And a whole coterie of birds and insects follow them in. And so sugar maple and other trees that the sapsucker work on is sort of the supermarket of the spring. And hummingbirds are among the first to come in and take advantage of it, to the extent that they will run off every other bird other than the sapsuckers from a productive tree like that. And I've seen that happen. Basswood, by the way, is one of the best woods for carving. It's a hardwood, but it's a very soft hardwood. And so bowl turners, and especially people who carve things by hand, really would love a chunk of a big basswood like that. And it produces thousands and thousands of little tiny seeds, which Jane tells me are edible.
Yes,
I'm not sure I trust her. I'm going to give them to Ken first.
Okay. It's amazing how basically most of in fact, all of the plants out here are either edible or medicinal. Now, medicinal has got a wide range between, it makes you feel a little bit better. Peppermint is medicinal. It's supposed to help your tummy, and that's a nice, mild medicinal. To something like...
Ipecac.
Yeah, the really super poisonous plants. And super poisonous plants usually have some medicinal benefit. As you know, if you take a bottle of medicine, it will kill you. And so will eating some of the plants out here. So you really need to know the difference between edible, lightly medicinal, and heavy toxic medicinal.
Used as a pot herb and an emetic.
yeah, that's right. And then there's things like deadly nightshade and those plants that are really got heavy-duty medicine.
Same with mushrooms.
This is a rhododendron section here, and a rhododendron clump is typical, having very little undergrowth. It's so heavy shade. There's very little that will grow underneath it.
And before the first settlers came into the area and started clearing roads, there were places that were basically impenetrable, and the old-timers that first saw them called them rhododendron hells or laurel hells because you can't get through them in a wagon or on a horse. And they're really quite difficult to make a path through. Unfortunately, that's another plant that has some injury going on. There are a couple of fox squirrels up on the hill.
Oh, yeah.
Gray fox squirrels. But rhododendrons, there's a disease that you see along the parkway between Chateau Morissette and Mabry Mill that I think it's a fungal disease.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of our plants around here are getting more fungal diseases, our gardens and everything, because it's been so wet here.
Wet and warm.
When we first came here about 20 years ago, the average rainfall in this area was about 40 inches, and I heard that last year we had 80 inches of rain here.
Welcome to Washington State.
Yeah, right, which is almost a rainforest.
Yep.
So lots of things are having a little trouble with that rain.
Start growing rice and sugar cane.
Right. This is kind of cool here. If you see this old post, that old post, who knows, it probably 50, 60, 80, 100 years old. It could be, because it is an old chestnut, really chestnut post. And of course, chestnut was such a hard wood, they used it along fence lines, and it lasted. Look, it's still in the ground there. Unfortunately, they all died of the blight, and that was a change in what was happening. And today, lots of things are changing, and we hope a lot of other plants will take over and grow as well as chestnut did at one time.
I thought this would be a good clip to put in where we were talking about beeches being damaged, to put MK, Mr. MK, macho, showing off for his girlfriend, I guess. They're leaving a sign for posterity, and the tree lives on. Thank you very much. Oh, and here's some, well, you can't see it very well, little sapsucker holes. Jane, you ever see this? It's more like they make vertical slots.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that. On my peach tree, I've seen it.
I think it's a sapsucker of some kind.
Yeah, they come in and they make that little string. And the first time I saw that on my peach tree, of course, I thought, oh my God, it's going to die.
Yep.
It's not particularly good for it, but it didn't kill it.
What doesn't kill me makes me stronger.
Yeah. Oh, look at what we've got here. It doesn't have any berries on it, but this is barberry. And barberry is a plant that is considered an invasive, and it grows just about anywhere. It's stickery, it's got little tiny thorns on it, and it's got some red berries on it that the birds tend to eat, which is why it spreads so easily. And berries are actually supposed to be edible for humans, and I've tasted one or two so far. I'm still here. I think they're okay. But the other thing that's interesting is, of course, getting to know any plant, whether it's an invasive or not. And the barberry has a root on it that includes berberine, which is a chemical that's found in ginseng. And it's the same kind of chemical in the ginseng root. And this plant was used in Chinese medicine a lot, very much like ginseng was used here. And ginseng used to be everywhere here. And of course, people over-harvested it so bad you don't find it anywhere anymore. And maybe this is an alternative. I don't know.
Jane is a good cop. Let me play bad cop for barberry. Barberry is one of the most aggressive and successful invasives in the country, because of the fact that it produces sexually and asexually. It has no natural predators. It's covered with thorns. It produces a wonderful environment underneath in a dense stand where there's very little light and high humidity. And unfortunately, that's exactly the kind of habitat that ticks like. And the white-footed mice like it because they're berries. It's free food. And the deer can't get in there to eat it, but the mice can get out to spread the ticks to the deer. And so getting rid of the barberry in large stands probably is not a bad thing to do, especially in Floyd County where we have such a high incidence of Lyme disease. So I'm bad cop.
That's right, and then there's that. So, there's always the plus and the minus sign,
Yep.
and you have to look at
The
them
yin
all.
and the yang.
Yeah, right. So maybe get rid of most of them, but save a few
Yeah.
for medicine.
Yeah.
This small trees here kind of spreading out wide, and you can see the leaf on it, is witch hazel. And you may have heard about witch hazel is used on the skin and for different purposes. But it's unusual in that it blooms really late in the season. It gets little teeny yellow flowers on it in October, November. I mean, really late. Everything else is dropped over.
They're the buds,
Yeah, already it's got buds on it already. So
even this late.
yeah, so it's just starting to bud, so it's not going to bloom for a while. But it's a really nice plant. And one of the things that's interesting too is because animals are not a whole lot different than us, I mean, our DNA of other mammals is like 90% the same, that a lot of the things we eat, they eat too, and a lot of the medicines that are good for us are good for animals. And so you find that, I know that like the bee farm here at Spikernard, many of the plants that they're using to give the bees for good medicinal health are the same ones that I use in my tea for our own health.
And so generally, if you see an animal eating something, it's okay for people?
No.
That's not a safe rule, is it?
Be careful with that. It may be and maybe not, because animals do have a little bit different digestion than we are.
Definitely.
And there's certainly a lot of cases like cows can eat tons of grass,
And
but
poison ivy.
they've got 4 stomachs and they can digest it a lot better than we can.
All right, I'll stay away from the grass.
Okay, you got to know what you're eating if you're in the wild.
The tree behind us here is a hickory, and you know that from the shape of the leaves, which you can see against the sun. They're a palmately compound, like a hand, fingers of a hand. And back when I was teaching, I would ask students who didn't know the names of things to make up a common name. If you didn't know what this was and you had to give it a common name, what would you call it? And they would say scaly tree and other things like that, and it's actually called a shagbark hickory. Shaggy, that's right. But that's very distinctive, and there are at least 3, shagbark, pignut, and mockernut. There are probably some other hickories. All of them produce a little very, very hard nut that if you're extremely hungry, you can get a little bit of meat out of it. But they're extremely good for wood that needs to be hard, and so the millinery, the textile industry used to use them for shuttles and things that went back and forth tens of thousands of times. Pick handles and other kinds of farm handles are made out of hickory. It's a very strong, resilient wood. And that's a healthy one. Jane, any idea how old that tree might be?
Well, it's hard to guess for sure because trees have quite a wide variety depending upon. I've seen 2 trees that I know were planted at the same time, one twice as big as the
Right.
other.
Nutritional.
So it's hard, but that probably is at least 40 years
That's
old,
what
don't
I'd
you
say,
think?
40, 50 years.
40, 50 years. And these, all hickories are providing nuts for the wildlife, and they really like that. Have you eaten any hickory nuts?
Oh, yes, I have.
Of course, good.
Take 2 bricks.
Take 2 grip and a fine pick because they are much harder to pick out than
walnuts or pecans. Absolutely. You got to
But
be
they
really
are
hungry.
sweet. They are actually a tasty nut.
Remember Earl Gibbons?
Oh,
Ever
yeah.
eat a hickory nut?
Right.
Many parts are edible.
One of the things we haven't quite talked about yet is humans' force in cutting down these forests and what it might do to the environment. And this part of it right here, you can see down the hill there that's all pine trees. And a lot of people call that a pine forest, but it's really not a forest at all. It's a crop. And those pines were planted so that they could cut them for timber later on. And that's all in good and not too bad. But one of the things about the soil and the land is if you cut down that forest or that set of pines right there and you take it away for lumber and then you let it grow back again or replant it as pine and you do that 2 or 3 times, each time you take that wood away, you're removing a whole lot of nutrients from that area. And after a few times, nothing's going to grow in that spot. And so people can buy land around here and it looks all nice and cleared and they think it might be really fertile. But in fact, if it's got a history of either agriculture of any kind, of constantly taking and taking and taking, that soil might be pretty bad. Where in an old forest, just by itself, this is the example of recycling in nature, is the leaves fall and they give their nutrients back to the ground and more things can grow, and every year the soil builds up until it's just a biodiverse area that's just amazing.
One place where we've sacrificed biodiversity for efficiency and profitability is in the even-aged timber management of the entire southeastern coast. I mean, for 100 miles inland, nothing but pine trees planted in rows, all the same species, all the same distance apart, cut them all to the ground, do it again, cut them to the ground, do it again, and nobody in that business can say how many times you can do that without totally mineral and nutrient depletion of the soil, but they do it anyway because it's highly profitable. So this woods is not profitable in that same way, but the biodiversity and the cooperation and the interaction that goes on there is sustainable. Even-aged timber management is not sustainable. And that's another way I think the future will be different from the past, is we're starting to realize we can't sell the foundation to pay for the mortgage. We've got to have our base for life, and it's the natural world. We can't see nature as a commodity for profit. And I think more and more people have seen that. In fact, Goldman Sachs, I think, just totally divested from fossil fuels because they saw that it was, in the long run, bad for their shareholders. The shareholders may not see that. In the short term, it's profitable. But the long-term prognosis is for climate change resulting from burning fossil fuels to be bad for all their stockholders. And what's bad for the stockholders is bad for Goldman Sachs. Or universities are divesting. So we're at a turning point. I just hope we have enough room to turn.
Yeah.
Because we don't have a lot of time.
We're at such a turning point right now. We've damaged so many ecosystems that the question is will we actually survive?
Yep.
Because we're still cutting down forest out there, and we need them with every breath we take.
And we need food, fiber, and furniture.
Right.
You know, there's a balance. There's a middle ground there that I think we can strike. But we got to get on my soapbox, we need to get rid of the growth economy because you can't, it's just logical that you can't grow forever. You can't live on a fixed basis and mine it forever.
Right.
And so the triple P, triple bottom line, work for the planet and profit and people and not just for the shareholders. And so I think that's latching on. I'm really encouraged by some of the things I see.
Yeah, a lot of young people are really, they get that.
The new economy.
They understand it, that that we really have to preserve these things, or they may not have a future. It may not be all that long. So we need to take care of this place.
Jane and I have the disadvantage of having looked at this for about 7 decades, and we've seen the trend in our lifetime. Yeah. And it's not gonna, it won't take another lifetime equal to ours with the same kind of decline. It's been extremely rapid. We were there at the first Earth Day.
Yeah, both of us were. Different places, but there at the first Earth Day. And we actually had some of the same people that we studied under, the very fathers.
Eugene Odom. And
yeah, right, the Odoms, who started with the very first textbooks on ecology. Yep. And so it's, and people have known the answers for a long time, what to do about it. But, you know, we're just having way too much fun building too much stuff. And now it's time to get a hold of ourselves and look at nature as the importance of this big tree is so much nicer than a big house. You want a nice small house, it's a good thing, but we want these big trees too. Locusts are one of the first things that grows in succession and secondary succession. So you see them on the edges of woods where they're getting a lot of sunlight, and they grow up. They have a very deep indentation in the bark. You can see them, and they're one of the first things that turns brown in the fall. But this isn't turning brown naturally yet. I'll let Fred tell you about the leaf miner.
This is a new phenomenon. I don't know how long. It's been here the 20 years we've been here. But you can see these leaves are brown, not entirely, but in pieces. If you hold one up to the sky, you can see light through it, where an insect between the upper and lower mesophyll of the leaf gets in there and eats out all of the chlorophyll. And so if that happens on all the leaves of the tree, it diminishes the amount of nutrients that the tree collects. And so when I first moved here in '97, somebody told me that a locust post didn't last as long in the ground if it were as a new post as the old post did. And I think that makes sense, is they're just not able to get the nutrition into the wood because of the locust leaf miners. And so the locust in the end of July look like it's fall, but it's not natural seasonal change. But it's one of the hardest woods and most resistant to rot, and so fence post.
Right, not only that, but they're also, because they're so resistant to rot, they stand in the ground once they're dead for a very long time. We've got one in our yard that I know was long dead when we moved there, and we've been there 20 years. And it's got these big holes in it where the woodpeckers have nested in it, and they say that, in fact, I've seen the pileated woodpecker actually flies to it and talks to its neighbors by pecking on that big hollow trunk. So it provides housing and communication for lots of other birds. And so many of these different trees have webs of functions that we still are learning about, and they're just so cool. This is a nice sturdy bench built by our local Boy Scouts and donated to the community. And that's one of the things that's so lovely about this path, is it is a community function. But you can look at the construction of it. It's really sturdy, it's simple, not expensive. I highly recommend it for pass on your own trails.
Mm-hmm. This is a good place to scan around and see the dominant plant in here, wingstem, which we've talked about before, but that's the way plants do. They bloom very slowly early on, then all of a sudden it looks like there's nothing but, and then they disappear. And what often happens, if everything's working like it's supposed to, as this plant peaks, the insects that feed off of it, the insects that come to use that as a hookup bar to make more babies, their peaks coincide. But as global warming changes the timing of things, one peaks and is gone before when the next one comes in, there's nothing there for them. And that's happening more and more. The timing is off. But a plant like this, each one of these little seed tops produces probably 20 to 30 seeds, and most of them fall to the ground and get eaten or don't make new plants. But you can see places that are favorable like this where it really becomes a thicket. And Jane was making the comment the other day that the shape and size of the leaf is very much dependent on how much sun and how much nutrients they get. So you can't always go by just the shape of the leaves, which is true for a lot of plants.
Right. And you're talking about the insects that eat them and being out of sync, which also puts the birds out of sync, because the birds eat the insects, and and they come in at different times. And
Honeybees.
so lots of things are getting out of sync these days.
There's honeybees on it, which a couple of years ago, I went all summer and didn't see a honeybee. I've seen 3 already right here.
Yeah.
So that's encouraging, maybe.
It's encouraging. A lot more people around here are getting interested in having honeybees. And so there's a lot more hives than there used to be, which is really helpful for the wild plants as well as our own plants.
I think the fact that spikenard chose to settle here because of the health of the land, and especially for honeybees, has made other people realize the assets we have of not having the herbicides and the mite problems and the colony collapse disorder issues that other places do. We've got them, but not at the level that other places do.
Right, and a lot more people are much more interested in planting wildflowers for the sake of not just the honeybees, but the wild bees. There's over 200 different species of bees in this area.
Bees.
And that are also very important because honeybees do a lot of pollination. That's why they're so important. But other bees do specific things and get the littler flowers and the bigger
bees.
flowers, right, and the squashes. So there's an amazing group of pollinators here, and the more of the wildflowers we have, the better they are. But even our own garden flowers, so like you said, the squash, that feeds the pollinators too. So we can grow things in our own garden, and herbs.
Mutual benefit.
Right, exactly. Bees love herb flowers. And so you can have a wonderful herb garden, which is good for you and good for the bees.
That is so nice lighting right now.
Yeah, isn't it pretty? You can see the bees quite nicely in there. There's a few things to talk about here, and one thing is this grass here that you may have noticed. And this is Japanese stilt grass, and it really did not used to be here. And it probably, I've heard some people say that it has been here in the area for about 10 years, but not everywhere. So apparently it started around that time, and it has spread everywhere really rapidly. And the most unusual thing about its spread is it seems to grow everywhere. It likes the sun and the shade and the wet and the dry. It will grow everywhere. We're not sure exactly what that does to the ecosystem, how much it outcompetes something. I know my lawn looks really good because it's very thick this year, but I'm not sure about what it's actually doing.
And as most alien species or invasive species, it's here by accident or not by choice. One of the common names for it is Chinese packing grass. And it was used early on because you can get such large quantities of it, to pad porcelain and stuff that came over from overseas. And I think that was in the 1920s, maybe, a little bit before that. And so it's found no natural predators, nothing eats it. I think it probably puts out some toxins into the soil that reduces competition from the natives. And you can see the lack of variety in the understory out there where it's growing. Stuff just can't come up. The good news is that it's an annual. If it doesn't set seed, it will die. But the bad news is if it's not cut before the 1st of September, it will set seed, and there'll be more of it next year. And the water will carry it everywhere the water goes.
And apparently it must have a lot of seed because it's growing everywhere.
Yeah.
It's easy to pull out. I mean, you just grab it and it just comes right out.
There's the seed head.
And it looks like the roots come out with it, but I bet there's still a lot of roots down in there.
Tiny, the seeds are almost invisible.
Right. So it's everywhere. But on the good side, well, it absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide. Imagine how much more CO2 is being absorbed here on the forest floor. Oh, here's another example of why we like dead trees as well as live ones. I see next to this is a big live white pine here, and it's a beautiful, great big tree. Probably, what do you say, over 100 years old anyway. Maybe even 100, a little over that, but it's pretty old. But this piece here has been dead for quite some time, but you can see all the holes in it where the woodpeckers have come to look for bugs, and probably things have lived in that and nested in it. And as long as that can stay up there, it's providing a lot of homes for wildlife.
Here's another non-native, very distinctive, a single leaf. Has that many leaflets, so it's called feather pinnate because it looks like a feather. And I'm gonna, well, I can smell it there. I was gonna break a piece of the bottom. I'm gonna hold this up to the camera and see if you can smell it. Breathe deeply. It smells like peanut butter to me. What does it smell like to you, Jane?
I don't know. It's a little bit of a strong
musty
smell. It doesn't smell particularly good or bad to me.
Well,
I've read that it smelled bad, but that's not that bad.
I'm gonna, because it will come back. If that were 5 times that thick, I could break it with my hand. It's a very easy tree to knock over, and it has a brown pith, which is why it's so easy to break, because there's very little wood in it. Mostly it's just feels like styrofoam in the center. So one thing you can do with it is take a stem that's maybe this long, cut it in half, cut the pith out of it, glue it back together again, and make a pea shooter.
I haven't tried that. Have you?
Yeah, works. Yep. You could do the same thing with a couple of other plants, but this is called Tree of Heaven, and it has nothing to do with the celestial places. It's a Tree of Heaven because it grows heavenward so fast. So this time next year, this one's not getting a whole lot of light, so it's not going to grow as fast. But out in the sun, it will double that height next year and double it again the year after that. And it's taken over on the Blue Ridge Parkway. A lot of the views, the former views, you now see nothing but Tree of Heaven.
But we could all just go out there and break them down with our bare hands.
You can break them down with bare hands, makes you feel so much better. Makes you feel empowered.
I wonder if they have any medicinal quality.
That I don't know. I'm sure you'll tell us. Next,
I'll have to find out.
Next trip. If you look out around us here, these shaggy plants with these little puffs of almost invisible flowers, they're so small you can barely see them, and they don't really have much in the way of petals. But it's in the aster family, and it has a very distinctive leaf. And it's called, well, one of the common names is mugwort. And Artemisia, Artemisia is the genus. And there are some Artemisia species in Europe from which wormwood comes, and it's the primary agent that's effective against malaria. And this one has some medicinal properties too that I'll have to look up. Oh, and I was gonna, they talked about having a smell. Oh, yeah.
It does.
I see Artemisia tea on Jean's.
Yeah, maybe. And you just sent me an article yesterday that they're actually doing some research to see if it has any effect with COVID.
And anti-cancer. I think COVID's out. The problem is the president of Madagascar is advising people to drink a tea from this, that it will prevent COVID, and it won't. And so that's happened before in other countries where people in high positions of power have made the mistake of giving bad advice.
Yeah.
And people say, yeah, we'll do that.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. The other thing that's happening is they drink that tea, it's decreasing the susceptibility of malaria to the treatment.
Oh, wow.
The more it gets out there in the public for non-therapeutic reasons.
Yeah.
Dope slap.
Yeah.
Whew, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Now you're going to have to come back on this trip when you can smell these things, because you've been at a disadvantage. So you have to come back, just you and your nose. Early on in the spring, when this plant with that distinctive sort of purplish green stem starts coming up, this one's very edible. It's called poke salad. And the problem with eating it is it has some toxins in it, so when you cook the leaves, you have to throw away the first water, cook them again, throw away the second water, then eat what's left. And I wouldn't think a whole lot left.
There's not much nutrition.
You can chew it and swallow it.
I say eat
spinach. If you
spinach.
put onions on it, it tastes like onions.
Yeah.
You get the onion nutrients. One neat thing about it, though, is that these berries are very staining. And Jane Cundiff has graciously volunteered for us to paint her entire nose with one of these. Come here, Jane.
I don't think I can. They are beautiful.
I did that yesterday, and it just came off this morning. So it stays as sort of like a cheap tattoo.
Yeah, it's a really pretty color.
Beautiful.
When Ella was
Yeah, this is the autumn olive here, and so, and this time of year, autumn olive has got berries on it, and you can see the little red berries. They have a little like an olive speckle on them. I guess that might be why they call them autumn olive. I'm not sure. But in any case, these berries are ripe right now, and you can feel, especially once they fall off in your hand. And they're definitely berries. And they're good. I like them. And some are better than others, just like any fruit. You know, you have some trees that are better than others. This one's pretty good. But the autumn olive has a silvery underneath its leaf. It's quite silver looking. And then it's got these fall berries, and it grows in these clumps. And this is about as big as they get. This one's quite large, and they grow on the roadsides. And this is considered a heavily invasive plant. And I'll let Fred tell you about the invasiveness of it.
Well, we had a field near our house that had 2 in it. It was about a 5-acre field. It had 2 in it one year. It had maybe 20 in it the next year, and it had more than you could count the next year. Of course, they were small, but they've gotten larger since. And the farmer didn't intend that. It was just neglect because he lived out of state and didn't keep up with it for just a couple of years. And so that's not a good thing, but if you find these things in full flower, the pollinators absolutely love it. It smells wonderful. And Jane, I think we think that it puts nitrogen in the soil even.
Yeah.
So it has some redeeming qualities, but if pasture maintenance is high on your list, you don't want these to get started, or multiflora rose, or any of the other field
And
invasives.
this has a lot of other characteristics too. This was actually brought over here to help stabilize roadsides because it grows fast, because it fixes nitrogen. The pollinators love it. The birds, the bees, and the bears. Mine are often just, I have pictures of bears tearing down the autumn olive trees to get to the berries. But it's really a natural thing that nature loves, but a lot of people don't. And they don't like it in their pastures, or they don't want it taking over places. But you know, it really only grows in places that have been damaged by humans. Mm-hmm. So it grows on roadsides, it grows in empty pastures. You do not see them get anywhere near this big in the middle of a forest. If the berries start to sprout there at all, they're just little bitty things. So this is, I kind of like it, and I have a few in my empty pasture that I encourage, and I eat the berries every fall, and I don't mind them, and I kind of like them there. But other people who want that empty pasture, well, they should be mowing it, and then it wouldn't grow. Right. Here we have a nice patch of goldenrod, and it's a beautiful flower this time of year. And if we were real still, look, already we see one of the pollinators, a little moth coming to it. But it's filled with all kinds of little organisms. And one thing about pollinators is we want them to eat from early spring till late fall. And so goldenrod is one of the things that feeds them late fall.
But a worry is that I've been watching the goldenrod for at least 20 years while we lived down on the creek. And I've known pretty much when to expect several different visitors. There's one, a blister beetle, that you never find in singles. You always find them in twos, and they're mating. And so this is a target place they go to hook up. And I haven't seen any this year. Wait, there's one. Did I get him? I think so.
I think so.
To see this thing to begin with, you'd say, oh, come on. Oh, what does it look like? What would you say it is? Looks like a, see it?
Yeah, it's very striped like a honey.
It's like a yellow jacket or something. Oh, yeah. That's protective resemblance. And that's a locust borer beetle. And that's another thing that I expect to find on the goldenrod this time of year. Yeah. So I'm glad I found one.
There he goes, freed again.
Well, that was a good trip.
Right, and goldenrod can get much bigger than this. You can see it really big. And actually, I use just a touch of it in my tea. It's pretty bitter, but it's a medicinal herb, and it's supposed to be good for kidneys. And so I just throw a few pieces. And the last batch of tea I gave you has a few pieces of goldenrod.
We had some yesterday.
Oh, good.
Well, thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks for joining us. It's been a wonderful hike. It's been a wonderful day here in early fall.
We were very fortunate.